So again, we'll welcome everybody. We will give folks another minute or two to sign up or to sign in, and then we'll get going. Well, I think we will get going. Welcome everybody. I'm sure we'll have some other folks join us. This is the beginning of our weekend, or at least our 2 days of Arbor Day celebrations here in West Newbury, and the idea here is to, sorry, I'm just adjusting a few things, is to, for tonight, is to talk a little bit about the history of trees in West Newbury. And I will tell you about some of the limitations that we have regarding that history, but hopefully you'll get a picture of what West Newbury used to be like and what it looks like now. And then tomorrow we will have our tree giveaway at the library, on the library grounds between 10 and 11, and then starting right at 10. And then we will have another presentation. Tomorrow's presentation will be a virtual tour of trees in West Newbury that is designed to have you get more familiar with the trees that we have that are easily visible, usually along the roadsides, but sometimes on trails or at Mill Pond, and also then to talk about how to identify those trees. And I'll talk a lot more about the tricks of the trade, if you will, tomorrow morning. But tonight is to talk about, tonight's presentation is to talk about what has happened in West Newbury and in New England as a whole, because our history is difficult to ascertain before 1880 in terms of photographs. There may be records, but they're long buried or they're sparse, or it would take, a legion of people to put together a picture from individual entries in ledger books. So for the beginning of our talk on West Newbury, we'll talk about New England as a whole, knowing that we were part of that history, and likely whatever we figure out about the history of New England will apply to us. So, and then once we have photographs available and better record keeping, then we can take a look at what West Newbury used to be like in the 1880s and the early 1900s, and then what it looks like now. For those people that don't know our town, we're a small 17 square mile town on the North Shore, not very far from New Hampshire, and our background is rural and farming. And we are 35 miles north of Boston, and we're sandwiched in between mill towns, Haverhill and Amesbury, and a shipbuilding town, Newburyport. So we are, if you will, the country cousin. And we'll see how this plays out during the late 19th century and early 20th century. But we're starting off with this picture of the great elm on Main Street, which is truly remarkable. It was cut down shortly after this picture was taken. And we'll talk about that in a little while as to why that might have happened. But can you imagine, it was already 200 and maybe almost 250 years old at this point when this picture was taken over 140 years ago. So if we had had this beauty still in existence, it would be truly a sight to behold. Well, some thanks are due to some of the people at the library that helped me with some pictures. John McGrath that gave me a car tour on finding some remarkable trees. And then there was a book from which many of the images were taken. You can see it listed there by Susan Follansby and Jane Wild, so thanks to them. And of course, thanks to Julius Sterling Morton, the first proponent of Arbor Day in 1882, where it was first adopted in the state of Nebraska, as it turns out. Well, our landscape has certainly changed. This is West Newbury as it looked from the Rocks Bridge. I suppose looking southeast would be my guess, or east. And what we can see is that there were not very many trees in 1892. And this, in some ways, makes sense in terms of our history. We'll see what it was, or we'll think about what it looked like before this, before farming took hold. But certainly this is not the view from the bridge today. And here's another picture. This is the earliest picture that I was able to find in 1885 of the Brickett farm. And you can see that the land is pretty much cleared for agriculture. And we're going to talk about what kind of agriculture led to this. And I would just point out the stone walls in the foreground play a role in the agricultural development of West Newbury. But certainly this landscape, in terms of our tree cover, is pretty sparse. Today we have almost 60% tree cover. And certainly the prior picture and this picture would lead us to believe that we have much more tree cover today than in prior days. And this is also true for the rest of New England. We may have some nuances here, but here's a picture taken by the former Harvard Forest director, David Foster, of exactly the same landscape, or he found a picture in 1890 and he went back and he took a picture of it today. And you can see that we have reforested in New England in general, and certainly in West Newbury. Well, therein lies the story. There's a lot of literature that talks about New England forests and what had the greatest impact: the climate, the indigenous peoples, the later Europeans. But certainly most everybody agrees that it's a cultural landscape, meaning that human activity played a big role in what the New England landscape and the New England forest looked like. And here's another picture. This is as late as 1954. So this is now, 60 to 70 years later than the two pictures I showed you before. And we still see there are a few more trees up along the edge of properties, perhaps, but still quite an agricultural looking landscape as late as 1954. Well, let's go back and let's go back and look at the earliest days and what people think the landscape looked like. And so we're talking pre-European times, and then we'll look at colonial times. Here's a picture of the diorama that the Harvard Forest Museum has developed to show us what at least one group of people think the forest looked like in all of New England. Wherever you are joining this call, this is likely what it looked like. And you see that this would obviously qualify as old growth. There are gaps in the canopy, so it's not solid. There are large trees and smaller trees in the understory. It looks like there's maybe some kind of small trees here waiting to get started once the larger trees might die. But a thick forest, and certainly was the basis or was an important part of the indigenous peoples. Well, you might ask what trees were actually the most common, the predominant trees in this pre-colonial era. And obviously the records are sparse. This has been cobbled together by a lot of researchers, presumably people going for their PhDs and otherwise. Um, and they looked at surveyor records and whatever was around in the early days that talked about the trees that were present, at least in the colonial era. And so we can assume, or I'm assuming, that at least the predominant species in the colonial era were the predominant species before the colonial era. It doesn't mean when I say that there were the same number of trees, but certainly the predominant species would not necessarily have shifted. Who knows? But this is an assumption I'm making, and you can see where West Newbury is in the red boxes there. And so what do we see in terms of the predominant species? Well, birch, hemlock, and beech were more prevalent in the western part of the state, not so much in the east. The size of the black dots indicates the relative frequency that they found. It's not quite a percentage, but at least it gives you some idea of quantitatively what was more common, if you will. We don't seem to have very many. Maybe there's some birches and beeches around, or hemlocks, but not very many. But if you look at the pines and the oaks, we can say, at least from these data, that oak and pine were common here. Chestnut, not so much. Chestnut seemed to be in the middle of the state. Maples, you would think, well, we probably should have a lot of maples. And probably we had red maples, but again, at least these data suggest that it was not as common as the oaks and the hickories and the pines. Well, who used the forest in these early days, the pre-colonial days? I'll get to colonial in just a moment. There were, and these numbers and these ideas are from I don't remember the book title right now, but I think it's This Land Is Their Land. And the fellow who wrote it really had a lot of information on the indigenous peoples. So what the highlights are that it was well populated, 100,000 people in indigenous peoples in New England. And the tendency was, at least in the early times before corn, and then later, especially with the Wampanoags, to move seasonally for their subsistence. So in spring, they would find the rivers where the shad were running, or maybe other fish were running, and they would gather food in that way. In the summertime, they would go to the oceans and for harvesting seafood, but also for social gatherings. And then in the fall and winter, they would, if you will, retreat or move to the forest for hunting animals. And that was the seasonal movement. And what they, at least the Wampanoags did, is they had seasonal dwellings that they occupied and then they vacated, but they didn't take them down. And they were made of wood, so there's a use of forests in addition to the animal hunting. And they just left them, and then the next year they would come back to these wetus and live there during whatever season they happened to be in, and then they would move on again in this sort of cyclical pattern. Very interesting. And the only reason why I show the map of the native settlements and trails is just to give you an indication that, and this is 1600 to 1650. This was well settled and well traveled, and there's a lot of history going back to this era, but not that relevant to our discussion about forest tonight. Well, what about the early European settlers? Well, they came from, as you can see, a temperate area of meadows and gardens, and they were really pretty unprepared for the New England winters. Were much more bitter, cold, and longer than what they had experienced in Europe. And really, the forest saved them, because while they were fearful of the forest at the beginning, the abundance of wood provided them an easily obtainable fuel source for heat. And in some ways, the forest saved these early European settlers. And gradually, they began to understand or learn more about what the native peoples did and used the forest for more of their needs. But at least in the very first years, they were saved by the forest in terms of not freezing. Any lumber they cut eventually was not sent to England initially. And this was an interesting picture I found. This was certainly I guess, an etching depicting in 1730. So it's a little bit later than what we were just talking about, but a fairly a significant shipyard going on in Newburyport, which has a long shipping history. And this was going on in our town next door. We were still the country cousin. We'll talk about that in a moment. So there was use of wood for shipbuilding. And then one of my favorite parts of this is when King George decided to have his broad arrow, these three gouges out of the bark of a tree, to mark the tree so that it would be considered for royal goods. And his target were the eastern white pines, which were straight, which were strong but yet flexible, so they wouldn't snap, and perfect for ship masts. And at the time, they were getting their ship masts from the Baltic states, but these were viewed as superior. And as a result, King George decided to mark all the biggest and greatest white pines for his navy. That really ticked off the colonists. And you can see in some of the writings about this that this was really insulting to the max, if you will, because the colonists had been using these trees for all their wood needs and did not want the biggest and best to go to England. Well, the trees in the American Revolution played a role in terms of spurring it on, and you can see that on the left, the Bunker Hill flag, it's a little bit hard to see perhaps, has a white pine in the upper left corner against the white background. And of course, we have the American elm, the Liberty tree in Boston, where this is, I believe, the protest against the Stamp Act, where they hung the governor in effigy. And so the trees were important in the American Revolution. And if you broaden our look now at what the landscape was like in this era, you can see this is a very busy diagram. Don't pay any attention to the squares, just the colors, that's all, just the colors. And I've indicated where West Newbury is in the little green box. But the New England is not categorizable as a whole. Southern New England is quite different than northern New England. Coastal areas are different than the upland mountain areas. And so what you have in this era is this kind of, or these kinds of different forests. And you can see the red is mixed conifers and hardwoods in two different places, one down East Main and the other in the New York area. And then you see in the far north and in the mountain regions of Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Vermont, spruce fir and hemlock, while in the coastal areas where we are and where Connecticut and Rhode Island are, mixed hardwoods. So the forest is different in different parts of New England. And certainly there was logging in this era of the colonial times and in the 1800s. And it was, as I say, by oxen, by horse, by river, and then eventually by railroad. And you can see that it was in the big transport in the lower left was to send these logs down a chute into the river. And then you can see the piles of wood, of timber in the river and transported to the sawmills. Well, at the same time logging was going on, there was certainly an attempt to clear the land for agriculture. But the problem is that, as I say, growing crops in rocky terrain is hard. And so New England was really not prime farmland for the developing country, for supporting all the cities that were arising. So in this area, and I wish there was data, but I have not been able to find it. But generally speaking, in New England, pasturing sheep was the answer in the rocky terrain. And what happened is that the farmers who had been trying to plant crops in fields had been clearing the fields of rock, and they just had them in piles. Well, that's ready-made fencing material. And think also that maybe the forests were being logged, so maybe there was less readily available wood for fencing. Maybe it was to be used for a higher purpose. And so why not use the rocks that were piled up? And the answer or the outcome of this was that sheep were first imported from England. I think it was in 1809, some merino sheep came over, and that created a sheep craze, if you will, until about 1850, when events overtook the economics of sheep raising and of milling the wool. But certainly between 1800 and 1850, and I would love to know how many sheep were here, but I don't know anybody that knows. Sheep were the major, or one of the major agricultural products. And all you needed was to keep them inside a fence of 4 feet high, because they're not like goats, they don't climb, so a 4-foot high fence was perfectly fine to keep your neighbor's sheep out of your sheep. Well, you had rocks, so hence our stone walls were originally not so much to mark property boundaries as they were to fence in the sheep. Well, of course, that was also, if you're fencing in a pasture, you might put it along your property line. And it turns out, not my numbers, but from people that have done a lot of research, the fellow that wrote the book, The Granite Kiss, reports this. By 1852, New England and New York had over 252,000 miles of stone walls to fence in animals. That's an incredible number. It's more than England had, as I understand it. And if you think about that, the moon is 240,000 miles away. We had enough stone walls in our 6 states plus New York to go to the moon and then some. That's a lot of stone walls, and attests to the abundance of rock in New England and the difficulty of farming crops. Well, what else was going on at this time? And this had a big impact on New England. You can see the numbers that I wrote in on when these areas became states. And it's supposed to be just a general picture. At this time in the 1800s, the first half of the 1800s, that's when the first big pulse of westward movement for the country occurred. Now, this had great consequences for New England, and we'll talk about those in a moment. So the westward expansion was significant in terms of what was happening in the country as a whole and what was happening in New England. And also the railroads came in. And this map, I've drawn the dotted line where it says 1850. That was the maximum extent of the railroads in 1850. And I'll tell you that I spared you the map of the eastern part of the country, where there were a lot fewer black lines as well. But at least the westward extent, to make the point, was only up to Lake Michigan in 1850. I mean, even just one rail line, and you can see in 20 years, by 1870, there was a whole, the country was, well, there were a lot of railroads to all parts of the country, especially if you look north in the Midwest to Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. So when railroads came in terms of trees, what it allowed was not the getting the logs to the sawmills was not only by river, it could be by rail over long distances. And that made a big difference, because if the demand in the larger cities on the East Coast was for wood and was growing, and no rivers would be running there, you could load the timber from the Midwest and get it by rail to the East Coast. That made a big difference. And of course, it was the start of Frederick Weyerhaeuser, one of the richest Americans of all times. It depends on how you calculate this and whether you use some of the last 5 years of data with some of the people who are getting rich from technology. But he was equal in wealth to the Rockefellers and to the Vanderbilts and so forth. And he was the timber king. And he exploited those lake states that I pointed out in the Midwest. That was where he got his, well, he worked in different places, but that was where he really made his fortune to start. And then he moved to the West Coast. So the pressure on logging in New England was reduced significantly by this westward movement and by the attention of these lumber barons. Well, what was happening then in New England? And what was happening was that farms, after the sheep craze, if you will, were being abandoned. And this had great impact on the nature of the forests in New England. Because the first thing that happens, or at least in that era, one of the major things that happened, and happened first, was that white pines, because of their ability to broadcast a lot of seeds and their growth, their rapid growth rates, white pine regrew in these abandoned fields. Where did the people go? They went to the cities for better employment and not such hard life. And that's common in a lot of countries. There are a lot of studies note this as the first stage of what happens after, or what happens when farming is no longer economic. Well, the white pines grew, and then it turns out that the ever entrepreneurial New Englanders decided, gee, we've now got a lot of white pines again. Let's log them. So there was a second period of pretty intense logging that re-cleared the land in the dates that you see there, 1890 to 1920. But the significance there is, number one, it was short-lived, maybe 20 years, maybe 30 years, but that's about it. And second was, in these formerly abandoned farmlands where white pines had regrown, the understory was hardwoods, but they were restrained in their growing by the canopy and by the density of the white pine forest in the last half of the 19th century. Well, once this second pulse of logging occurred and the white pines were removed, that released the hardwoods to grow. And they could then grow, and they became reestablished, or they either got established or reestablished. And then that's what we see today, is these mixed forests, especially around here in West Newbury, of white pine and hardwoods mixed together. So the westward movement really precipitated this kind of change in the landscape in New England in general. And here is, it's a little bit busy, but it's a very, very important graph. So I'll explain it just for a moment. The dotted line is the population. And you can see over between 1600 and 2000, the population curve. The other lines, the colored lines, are individual states and the percentage of forest cover. So you can see, let's say before 1800, there was a decline. I'm moving my cursor up and down at 1800. You can see there was a decline in forest cover because people were clearing the land, people were using building houses, et cetera, et cetera. But the big dip in forest cover was between 1800 and 1850. And then lo and behold, when the farms were abandoned and the clearing of land for agricultural purposes and the sheep, which occurred between 1800 and 1850, when that stopped, well, then the farms were abandoned, the white pines regrew, and so on, just as I said before. And you can see that there was a period of reforestation between 1850 and 1950. And of course, we have some deforestation after that in the post-World War II baby boom and so on. But these data certainly match the pictures and the ideas that the Harvard Forest dioramas, those four pictures that I showed you before, suggest. And it's very interesting because you can compare states, and this large gray line is the average, all the states averaged together. And you can see that Maine, this light green, had less deforestation than, for example, the red line, which is Vermont, or the dark green line, which is Connecticut. So it's very instructive in terms of matching some of the images we had with some of the data that were cobbled together by these authors at the bottom. Well, enough about New England. What about West Newbury? You can see some of the details, settled in 1835 by English livestock investors. And originally it was part of the Newbury plantation, which we now know as Newbury. And in 1819, it was incorporated as a separate town. And you can see the residents, the population of residents at 4 points in time. We obviously were not off to a great start in terms of we did pretty well until the Civil War, but and I don't know why, for some reason our population fell off. But on the other hand, it was, if you will, fairly stable. We stayed about the same size. There was no population explosion, if you will. And what was here in terms of people's livelihoods? Farming. That was the big one. Orchards, nurseries, and truck farms. So I want to there were other industries in town, but the major landscape feature and the major occupation, if you will, in terms of land use, was farming. And there's lots of interesting stories about the comb factories and the shoe factories and the blacksmith and so on. So we retained our farming base here perhaps longer than some of the surrounding towns. And it really lasted well into the 20th century and somewhat today. Well, again, here's the view of West Newbury before 1878. Some dwellings close by the church in town. We'll see some more of that later, the church up here, but a lot of cleared land because of the farming. And we, at one point, I forget whether we had 13 or 11 dairies in town. I love this picture because it's an era gone by, and the fellow who's delivering the milk, I believe, has a bow tie on. It's pretty interesting. There's a lot of history to some of these early businesses, if you will, and more pictures because they're of people. and not so many pictures of just landscape and trees. Well, again, we come back to the great American elm on Main Street, and we can see now we're looking towards the west from probably around Molly's house towards the church, and this is the great elm. And as I said, it was a little bit over 200 years old in this picture, and it would have been, well, maybe I forgot when I introduced it early on, but would have been maybe 370 years old today, would have been remarkable. And clearly anybody coming into West Newbury today would stop and marvel at this tree. And it's a bit of a sad story because allegedly, and I have not investigated this, but I certainly have some skepticism about this, that allegedly it suffered fire damage when the Ruddock shoe shop caught fire, and it was removed in part because of that. Well, I think the reason why it was removed was because they wanted to lay these horsecar line tracks in 1886, and the elm didn't want to go. It resisted cutting and sawing for over a week and ultimately cost a lot more than they thought it was going to be to take it down. Well, what happened? Why did they cut this down? Well, because they had this thing, this conveyance called a horsecar line. I had never heard of this before. Horses were pulling a trolley-like car, but that was on train track type wheels. So it was pulled by horses, but it was not self-powered by any engine. It was on the rails. So that's what a horsecar line is. And that seems to be why that elm was taken down, to make room for this. Well, here's a picture, undated, but here are the horsecar lines on the side of the road. And this is from basically the center of town today towards looking east. And you can see the horsecar lines that were on the side of the road. And you can see at this point, it looks like just all horse carriages using the road. Now, we're going to see a lot of pictures of West Newbury. So as we go through in this early period, so as we go through, think about, and I'm going to compare what some of these views are today versus what these older pictures show. Think about what trees are there. Think about how much tree cover we have. And I have certain ideas about it that in some ways surprised me when I was looking at some of these pictures. But you can see potentially that there are some elms along Main Street. Some of the ones in the distance look a little bit small, but it's a little bit hard to tell exactly what species they are. But there were some trees, but not gigantic trees along Main Street. But also what was going on, and part of the reason why the land looked so cleared in some of the early pictures, was that there was a lot of orchard work being done in West Newbury at the time. John McGrath said that just like sort of the sheep craze early on, there was a craze about planting apples in the early 1900s. And Long Hill Orchard was founded in 1915. And what do? You clear the forest out, and instead of planting crops or pasturing animals, you put in apple trees. And that was apparently a favorite farming occupation at the time. And at the same time, starting as early as 1832, but going, as you can see, all the way to 2000, the Thurlows started the fairly famous Cherry Hill Nursery. And it was famous for peonies and for doing a lot of grafting of or creating cultivars of some garden plants, but it also purveyed a heck of a lot of trees. And just take a look at this catalog, which is in 1865. What is the nature of the trees that are being purveyed? Apple trees, cherry trees, pear trees, fruit trees. That's what that seemed to be a big push by the Thurlow Nursery. as I understand it, about 100 to 125 years ago, they also planted a heck of a lot of Norway spruce in town. And that's why we have all these very large Norway spruce as well in town. And we have the copper beeches, which are right around the most magnificent specimens in town, are right around where the Cherry Hill Nursery used to be, basically right on Cherry Hill Road. Here's a picture of delivering a tree to be planted in 1916. Look at the landscape behind this picture. No trees in sight. And here's a view from Cherry Hill Nursery. Sorry about the line in the middle, could not be avoided. But here's a picture of what Cherry Hill Nursery looked like around 1920. And you can see a lot of tree planting in the foreground. And then here's what the Cherry Hill Nursery looked like in 1966. Now, again, take a look at in the background, it seems as though we have more forests coming back. Now, I don't exactly know what properties those were, but it's a pretty different picture than the ones that I showed you before, where trees were few and far between. And lo and behold, in 1925, we also had a town forest created. And you can see this is in Mill Pond. So here's Mill Pond. And if you park in Mill Pond today and you walk up this trail, you come upon this area that is or was the town forest. And if you join up with Poorhouse Lane Trail and you walk along here, here's where the cemetery is. And so it is of interest that 5,000 white pines were planted there around 1925. And they were obtained from the state. That was the forestry in the state was in that era was very big on gypsy moth control or figuring out what to do about gypsy moths and raising trees in state nurseries to either give or sell to towns to reforest them. And white pines were a favorite. Well, here's the side-by-side of our town center. And how much has the landscape changed? Now, this was just, there aren't very many photos. Again, people like to take photos of houses and people, not so much landscapes. But it looks to me like at least part of Main Street was much more, had much more tree cover than we have now. But again, I took all my pictures sort of during the period of time when trees aren't leafed out. So maybe it looks a little bit more dire. But certainly this area would appear to be more forested, if you will, in early days. Well, unfortunately, a lot of the trees that we had along Main Street were American elms, and the Dutch elm disease hit in the 50s and 60s like it did everywhere in this area. And a lot of the big ones were removed and died and were removed. Well, what about Main Street? This is a view looking west from about the car post towards the church, and you can see trees on the looks like there are a fair amount of trees, but not some old giants on the left in 1900. And trees are still there on the left in 2021. And looks like there's some bigger trees on the right side of the road. So in this picture, one might conclude that we have just as many trees as we used to. Well, what about looking eastward from that same vantage point? I believe this is true, where supposedly this is near the Noyes Comb Shop. So I tried to get exactly the same view today on Main Street. And we see some much bigger trees here on the lining the roads than might exist today, although we have lots of trees in the same area. So maybe our trees are a little bit younger, but they're still there. Well, what about, here's Brickett Farm. This was a picture from, I forget now, 1880 maybe, somewhere in there. And that's when I mentioned the stone fences. And here's the best I could do is an aerial photo, and certainly a lot more trees in the area than would appear in some 120 years ago. And thankfully, our West Newbury forests are still with us. Even if we can argue about Main Street has more or less, or some of the farms have more or less, we have about 59% tree canopy, at least according to some work that I did with a program called iTree. And that's right about the Massachusetts average, which is certainly skewed by all the forests out west. So I think we're doing pretty well. The green here, whether it's light green or darker green, is all different kinds of tree cover. The pale yellow is our cleared lands for fields, if you will, for agriculture. And then, of course, we have some of our wetlands and we have some of our reservoirs. So we are still in pretty good shape in terms of tree canopy. It doesn't mean we can't be quite careful about removing them. Well, what are the major threats today in West Newbury? Well, upper left, gypsy moth; upper right, emerald ash borer. Bottom three relate to developments and the idea that it's easier to cut down all the trees to move your equipment in, and then what you have to do is replant the trees, even if you do it poorly and these trees are not mulched properly. But one of the reasons that they always say they have to cut down trees is for control of runoff. So you have to put in detention ponds. Well, far be it from me to talk and I'm not a hydrologist, but it strikes me that trees do a pretty good job in managing water flow. And once you cut them all down, then you've got to do a lot more engineering. And what about this picture on the left that Barbara knows only too well? If there were any trees on that property, they would stop the erosion, which is guaranteed going to happen off that hillside. That's just, in my view, not a very thoughtful plan for how to prevent runoff and erosion. But I'm not an engineer, thank goodness. But I think that had there been some better thinking about the value of trees and what they could offer to the engineering issues on that property in the lower left, it would have been a better situation. Well, here's a gypsy moth laying some eggs in the egg masses. We've had gypsy moths around for 100 years, or over 100 years at least, that the foresters were concerned about. So, and there's a dynamic with the fungus that in a wet spring, so keep raining out there, in a wet spring, the fungus will keep the gypsy moth population down. But if you do see egg masses, you can remove them. Here's the projection for 2020 as to what happened, and you can see the red areas were hit pretty hard because we had a couple drought years. And you can see West Newbury, up in the upper corner, is not in the red, but certainly we had our share of damage, and that's the name of the biocontrol from a fungus called Entomophagia mimiga, or something like that. And then they will be here soon. I got this today. It's a forecast for the next week, sorry. And the yellow means that they are emerging. And you can see right here is Massachusetts. So the gypsy moths are here, they're emerging, and hopefully it will be wet enough that the fungus will provide us with some natural biocontrol. Our new problem is the emerald ash borer. And this is nothing but a bad story. And you can see that even though we are in the white, meaning that we don't have as heavy an infestation, we are surrounded by looks like fairly heavily infested areas, and we certainly have emerald ash borer damage that's becoming ever more increasing. Here's a healthy ash tree on the left, Here's a diseased tree in the middle. You can see the crown is thin. There's also growth from the trunk called epicormic growth. Doesn't look nearly so good as the tree on the left. And then, of course, we have a dead tree on the right. Unless you think you're going to escape this, the answer is no. Unless you inject your trees with some kind of systemic insecticide, then probably most, if not all of your ash trees will die. Here is Pipestave Hill last year. And that's all, those are all ash trees, and they're all dead because of emerald ash borer, which attacks and remains almost unseen for several years, and then the tree dies. And this is shortly after we become aware that there's a problem. And you can see that how thin the crown is on these other ones. So they're goners as well. This is this year, yesterday or today, yesterday. And I know it's early, so the trees haven't leafed out yet, but this is what we're going to see this summer on Pipestave Hill, right below the solar field. Well, what's the future hold? More people, less forest. These are pretty depressing numbers from this USDA Forest Service project to try to figure out what the future is going to be for forests. And you can see here for Massachusetts, our population is going to go up 20%, and we're going to lose forest land and timberland. So what that means is we need to think about the future. And this list is up on the Tree Committee website, and it's based upon the work of Professor Doug Tallamy out of University of Delaware, who, together with the National Wildlife Federation, has done a lot of work on figuring out which tree species support caterpillars, which then in turn support bird life. And the numbers, and he's done a lot of science work. It's not just thinking that natives are inherently better because they're native and they're not non-native. It's that there's a lot of science behind picking these particular types of trees to plant, and which will encourage the growth, encourage our animal life, especially our bird life. And you can get this list on the Tree Committee website. We'd love to have your support. The Tree Committee would love to have you work with us, formally, informally, whatever. And thank you very much for listening. And that is the end of the presentation. Let me see how we did on time. Well, not too bad. If people would like to ask a question, that would be fine. You can unmute yourself and ask a question. I'll do my best to answer. We won't go on too much longer. And if you need to leave, please feel free to do so.
Fred?
Yes. Hi, Barbara.
Hi. Is there any way that this whole hour can be reproduced tomorrow?
I don't think so. I mean, it says it's recording.
I want my husband to see this, but he is not here.
So well, there will be a recording. I have no idea if I can manage to get the recording available to everyone, but if I can, and I will inquire to see if it can go up on the West Newbury site where they keep some of the videos that they have saved.
Thank you.
I don't quite know because this recording is going to go into the Harvard system that I'm part of, and I don't know whether I can get it out of that system and get it to West Newbury, but I'll try.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Other questions?
Hi, this is Marcia.
Hi,
That
Marcia.
was great. During colonial times, what kind of trees were used for house building? Do you have any idea? You know, the surviving houses.
Yeah, there's actually a lot of work done on taking borings into the beams in old houses to find out things about the early climate and so forth. I
Yeah.
don't know the wood. Certainly the white pine would be a
Good
common,
guess, right?
commonly used because the grain is relatively straight. It's easy to cut. Chestnuts were certainly available, maybe not so much around here. But that's a great question. I would imagine oak as well. It's a good question because there are certain trees that have a twisted grain that are really hard to cut into lumber that can be used for building.
And
So,
and if I may ask a second question,
yeah.
so are you telling me my ash tree is going to die?
Yep,
Nothing, is it too late to do something?
it depends.
Okay.
So what you need to do is you need to get an arborist that can inject the tree with a systemic insecticide, which I don't like to do.
Right.
But if you have a special ash tree, that's, and I have had 5 of mine injected.
Okay.
Then the problem is to have some kind of assessment, because if the tree is, let's say, more than 40% diseased,
It's too late.
it may be too late. So
Okay.
we've been
Assess-
banging this drum as early as we could starting last summer. So I
Yeah.
would, and when we go offline, I can certainly tell you
Sure.
who you
Okay.
might want to call. But you can save them. You're going to have to inject them probably every other year. But it's not super expensive. I mean, it's not cheap, but it's not super
Well,
expensive.
Definitely worth
And that's a way to save at least a few important specimens.
Okay, thank you.
Fred, we're on the list for our arborist to come and do it, but that he hasn't been able to inject them yet this year because they're not leafed out enough. So there's still time to do it this spring.
Right. Well, actually, any time is a good time. I think we had ours injected late summer, and they just did a soil drench and assumed that the tree was, they injected it into the trunk, but we drenched the soil around it so that the water would be sucked up by the tree in late summer. And so we'll see what happens this year if the trees look any better. And we do have that one tree. Those were pictures of my trees, the healthy one and the unhealthy one. We do have that one healthy one that hopefully will be like a control. We'll see what a healthy tree looks like, and we can compare the other ones to it. But yes, I don't know. The main issue is having the trees moving water up from the roots, and they are doing that now. So I don't know for sure because I'm not a pesticide applicator, but I would think it's not necessarily too early to see if they can be injected. But again, I don't know for sure. Other questions? Well, thank you all for attending. I hope you enjoyed this. And tomorrow we have our tree giveaway at the library. The trees that are being given away are very interesting. They are Metasequoia, Glyptostroboides. I know you know what that is. It's the dawn redwood, which is not a California tree, although you might when you hear the word redwood. This will grow vigorously and large, but they are in the seedlings are about a foot and a half tall. And so come and pick up 1 or 2 at the library starting at 10 o'clock. And then at 11, we'll have the tree identification walk or virtual tour, some of which will be down Bailey's Lane by Marcia's house.
So it's a virtual, but you're walking?
No, I'm showing pictures that I took. So the idea will be if you start at the sign where you enter West Newbury, and as you drive in your car, here's what you're going to see.
Okay.
And then I do go down a little bit down the trail in Riverbend and on the trail on Mill Pond.
Nice.
But I will not be walking around with a GoPro camera on my head.
I have that image.
much as that would be quite amusing. Hi, Ed, how are you?
Good. I enjoyed the talk.
Good, good. It might be some things that you've heard me talk about before, however,
Yeah, that's true. But
but
it's interesting to note the cycle of forestation, deforestation, reforestation, and deforestation. That
yeah,
as the various uses of the land change.
yes, yes. And I thought, to me, what was fascinating was the impact of the railroad expansion to the west and
Yeah.
how that really triggered Weyerhaeuser focusing in on the lake states. And so New England in some ways did not become the center of the logging industry, the early days of it. Well,
The railroad map was a similar map that I've seen during the Civil War, which showed basically that the North had a much better transportation system than the South.
yes, yes,
That was interesting.
yes, it is. It is. Any other questions or comments?
Anyway, thank you.
You're very
signing off.
welcome, Ed. Good to see you.
Yeah.
Let me look at the chat. I see some folks with no questions there. Well, anyway, thank you very much for attending. I appreciate your time. And come and be with us tomorrow for the tree identification walk. And also pick up some of the dawn redwoods. All right. And Nicholas, good to see you, Nicholas. All right.
Thank you.
Bye,
Thanks, Fred.
everybody.
Thank
Good
you.
night.
Thank you. Good night.